June 6, 1944. The date hung like a guillotine blade over every Allied planner's head as they stared at the beaches of Normandy through grainy reconnaissance photographs. General Dwight David Eisenhower paced the cramped operations room in Portsmouth, England, knowing that his 35 divisions, 156,000 men, and 5,000 ships faced an engineering nightmare that could doom the entire invasion before a single boot touched French sand. The Germans had fortified every harbor along the Atlantic Wall with concrete, steel, and enough artillery to turn any conventional landing into a slaughter. But the real killer wasn't German guns. It was physics. How do you drive 30-ton Sherman tanks, mobile artillery, and supply trucks from a ship's deck onto an open beach without a dock? The answer, as it turned out, lay not in the halls of military academies or engineering schools, but in a Louisiana boatyard, where a stubborn shipbuilder named Andrew Jackson Higgins had been ignoring conventional wisdom his entire career. Higgins, a profane, cigar-chomping entrepreneur from Nebraska who'd settled in New Orleans, had spent the Depression years building shallow draft boats for trappers and oil prospectors navigating the treacherous bayous. His vessels could navigate water so shallow that, as locals joked, they could float on a heavy dew. By 1942, the United States Navy faced a crisis that made Higgins's eccentric expertise suddenly invaluable. Traditional landing craft required troops to climb over the sides, exposing them to withering enemy fire. Earlier attempts at bow door designs had failed catastrophically. The boats either swamped, got stuck, or simply broke apart under combat quantity. As the Marine Corps had tested numerous prototypes during the Pacific Island campaigns, and the casualty rates were unconscionable, Major General Holland McTeer Smith, the aggressive Marine commander known as Howlin' Mad Smith, had watched too many of his men die in the surf at Tarawa in November 1943, cut down as they waded chest-deep through coral reefs toward Japanese machine guns. Higgins had already caught the military's attention with his Eureka boat, designed with a protected propeller and a reverse-curve bow that prevented swamping. But when Navy planners approached him about a bow ramp for vehicles, every maritime engineer they consulted declared it impossible. The weight distribution would be wrong. The ramp would create drag. The boat would nosedive or flip. The list of technical objections filled multiple reports. Higgins listened to exactly none of them. According to records from the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, an institution that houses extensive documentation of Higgins's contributions, he sketched his revolutionary design on a restaurant napkin during a meeting with Navy official S in late 1941. The concept was audacious in its simplicity. A flat-bottomed boat with a retractable bow ramp made of reinforced plywood and steel, capable of delivering a 30-ton tank directly onto a beach, then reversing off and returning for another load. The military brass called it suicide. Higgins called it Tuesday. Within weeks, his shipyard began producing prototypes that would transform amphibious warfare forever, and ultimately determine whether Eisenhower's master plan for liberating Europe would succeed or collapse in bloody chaos on the Norman shore. February 9, 1942 marked the day Andrew Higgins received a telegram that would reshape his company's destiny and alter the course of military history. The Bureau of Ships wanted to test his vehicle landing craft design against existing models in a competitive trial. Failure meant obscurity. Success meant the largest manufacturing contract in naval history. Higgins, never one for false modesty, told his chief engineer, "We're going to build a boat so good they'll have to buy it, and we're going to do it in 3 weeks." What emerged from Higgins Industries' ramshackle collection of warehouses along the New Orleans waterfront was the landing craft, vehicle personnel, immortalized in history as the LCVP, or simply the Higgins boat. The design defied every principle of traditional naval architecture. Instead of elegant curves and careful weight distribution, Higgins employed brutal practicality. A 36-foot-long rectangular box made primarily of plywood, with a bow ramp held by steel cables and operated by a simple hand winch. The boat's draft, the depth it sat in the water, measured a mere 3 feet forward when empty, allowing it to deposit troops mere yards from the shoreline. The genius lay in details that seemed almost comically simple. The propeller sat in a recessed tunnel, protecting it from sand and obstacles. The boat's flat bottom created a stable platform, but used a subtle V-shape at the bow to cut through waves. Most revolutionary was the ramp itself. Higgins reinforced marine plywood with steel plates, creating a surface strong enough to support a jeep while remaining light enough that the boat's underpowered diesel engine could still propel it at 9 knots. When lowered, the ramp created an instant bridge from military vessel to hostile shore. The Bureau of Ships testing ground at Norfolk, Virginia became the stage for maritime David versus Goliath encounters throughout spring of 1942. Established defense contractors arrived with sophisticated designs, incorporating complex hydraulics and expensive materials. Higgins showed up with plywood, brass fittings, and unshakable confidence. During trials, they had subjected landing craft to conditions simulating beach assaults. Competitors' boats foundered, swamped, or suffered mechanical failures. The LCVP performed flawlessly, disgorging 36 combat-equipped troops, or an entire truck in less than 30 seconds, then backing off the beach and returning for another load. Rear Admiral Howard Leroy Vickery, who oversaw the Maritime Commission's shipbuilding program, initially expressed skepticism about Higgins's unconventional methods. The shipbuilder had no formal engineering training, employed a chaotic management style that drove Navy liaison to distraction, and built boats using techniques that violated standard practices. But Vickery couldn't argue with results. By August 1942, Higgins Industries held contracts for 12,000 landing craft, more boats than some nations' entire navies. Scaling production to meet military demands required transforming Higgins Industries from a modest boatyard into an industrial colossus. Higgins purchased 7 manufacturing plants across New Orleans, converting warehouses, old cotton mills, and even a former Mardi Gras float factory into assembly lines. His workforce swelled from 500 employees in 1940 to 20,000 by 1943, including thousands of women and African Americans in integrated work crews, a radical practice in the segregated South. Rosie the Riveter became Rosie the Boat Builder, wielding welding torches and driving rivets into landing craft that would carry their sons and brothers to war. The production system Higgins devised anticipated modern manufacturing techniques. Rather than building boats sequentially from bow to stern, his plants constructed modular sections simultaneously. All segments, ramp assemblies, engine mounts that converged on final assembly lines. At peak efficiency, Higgins Industries completed 1 landing craft every 17 minutes, a rate that even Henry Ford found impressive. August 7, 1942, the date America learned whether Higgins's plywood gamble would save lives or waste them. Waves crashed against the volcanic beaches of Guadalcanal as United States Marines made the first major Allied amphibious assault against Japanese-held territory. First Lieutenant Alexander Archer Vandegrift, commanding the 1st Marine DI. Vision watched through binoculars as Higgins' boat surged toward Guadalcanal shore carrying his assault troops. Everything, the entire Pacific strategy, future island-hopping campaigns, perhaps the war itself, depended on whether these odd-looking plywood boxes could deliver troops safely through enemy fire. The landing craft performed beyond even optimistic predictions. Higgins' boats navigated treacherous coral reefs that would have gutted conventional vessels, then drove directly onto black sand beaches. Ramps dropped with metallic clangs, and Marines charged ashore, establishing beachheads before Japanese defenders could organize effective resistance. The speed shocked everyone. Traditional landing methods required troops to vault gunnels while standing waist-deep in surf, a process taking minutes under the best conditions and proving suicidal under fire. Higgins' boats emptied their human cargo in seconds. But Guadalcanal also revealed brutal truths about amphibious warfare. Japanese machine gunners quickly learned to concentrate fire on the bow ramps as they dropped. Marines in the first rows, closest to the front, became known with grim humor as the Expendables. The plywood and steel construction that made the boats light enough to beach also meant they offered virtually no armor protection. Bullets punched through hulls. Mortar fragments shredded the thin walls. Coxswains, the sailors piloting the landing craft, stood completely exposed, steering their boats toward beaches erupting with gunfire, knowing they presented perfect targets. Casualty reports from those early Pacific operations prompted urgent modifications. Higgins Industries added steel plates around the coxswain's position and reinforced the bow sections with additional armor, accepting reduced capacity as the price of survival. Engineers experimented with different ramp dropping mechanisms after several boats suffered jammed ramps that trapped troops inside floating coffins. Some modifications emerged from combat veterans' suggestions: grip handles welded to the ramp's sides, drainage holes to prevent water pooling, roughened surfaces to prevent soldiers from slipping on blood-slicked metal. The Battle of Tarawa in November 1943 tested Higgins's design to its absolute limits and exposed a critical vulnerability. Marines discovered that Higgins' boats, despite their shallow draft, couldn't clear Tarawa's extensive coral reef system at low tide. Thousands of troops had to abandon their landing craft, hundreds of yards offshore, and wade through chest-deep water toward Japanese fortifications. The resulting carnage, over 1,000 American casualties in 76 hours, demonstrated that even the best landing craft had limitations. This disaster prompted development of the landing vehicle Tract, an amphibious tractor that could crawl over reefs, but the incident also validated Higgins's fundamental design. According to accounts preserved in the Marine Corps Historical Division archives, after-action reports consistently praise the LCVP's reliability, speed, and seaworthiness. Marines might curse the plywood walls that couldn't stop bullets, but they recognized that Higgins' boats gave them a fighting chance, something no previous landing craft had provided. By early 1944, Higgins Industries had produced over 15,000 landing craft of various types. The boats appeared in every theater of war: North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and across the Pacific Islands. Each campaign refined tactics and revealed new technical requirements. Eisenhower's staff, planning the greatest amphibious invasion in history, studied these combat reports obsessively, knowing that Normandy's success depended entirely on
whether Higgins's insane plywood ramps could deliver overwhelming force onto Hitler's Atlantic Wall before German defenders slaughtered the assault waves in the surf. On January 17, 1944, found Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower hunched over a battered desk in London's cramped Norfolk House, reviewing an intelligence estimate that made his ulcer flare. German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had transformed France's coastline into the most heavily fortified defensive position in military history. The Atlantic Wall stretched 3,000 miles, bristling with concrete bunkers, artillery casemates, millions of mines, and obstacles designed specifically to destroy landing craft. Rommel's engineers had studied Allied operations in the Mediterranean and Pacific, learning from each Allied success how to make the next invasion bloodier. The German preparations targeted Higgins' boats with almost personal malice. Rommel ordered Belgian gates, massive steel structures 10 feet high, embedded in the sand at the high water mark, positioned to rip out the bottoms of landing craft. Czech hedgehogs, welded steel rails arranged like giant jacks would impale boats attempting to beach. Wooden stakes called Rommel's asparagus, many topped with mines, created forests of death in the shallow water. Intelligence photographs showed these obstacles multiplying daily. Rommel reportedly told his staff, "The Allies will have exactly 6 hours to win the war. If we can push them back into the sea during those hours, they'll never return." Eisenhower's planning staff calculated that Operation Overlord, the Normandy invasion, would require landing 175,000 troops and 50,000 vehicles within the first 3 days. Every soldier, every truck, every artillery piece had to cross the Beach 2 ship barrier that Higgins's boats represented. Rear Admiral Alan Goodrich Kirk, who commanded the Western Naval Task Force, presented sobering statistics. Even with favorable conditions, planners expected 30% casualties in the first wave. If the landing craft failed, if they couldn't navigate the obstacles, if they swamped in rough seas, if the ramps jammed, the casualty rate would approach total. Yet Eisenhower had no alternative. The entire Allied strategy depended on opening a Western front to relieve pressure on the Soviet Union and strike toward Germany's industrial heart. Without Higgins' boats, that strategy collapsed into fantasy, as Eisenhower later wrote in his memoir. Crusade in Europe, a source that provides invaluable first-hand perspective on these decisions, he recognized that Andrew Higgins's designs represented the critical vulnerability and the essential strength of the invasion plan. Everything else, air superiority, naval gunfire, airborne operations, served only to improve the odds for those Plywood boats. The Supreme Commander made a decision that reveals both his strategic genius and his willingness to accept horrific risk. Rather than attempting a conventional assault on a single beach, Overlord would strike 5 beaches simultaneously across 50 miles of Norman coastline. This approach would require an unprecedented number of landing craft operation. Overlord's final plans called for over 4,000 Higgins boats and similar vessels participating in the assault. The strategy accepted that casualties would be heavy, but gambled that the sheer volume of troops delivered simultaneously would overwhelm German defenses through mass rather than finesse. Eisenhower's staff spent months refining the timing to maximize Higgins' boats' effectiveness. The invasion needed to occur at dawn for visibility, but at low tide to expose Rommel's underwater obstacles, allowing Navy demolition teams to clear paths before the main assault. This narrow window occurred only a few days each month. Further added, another variable, rough seas would swamp landing craft, but the invasion couldn't wait indefinitely. German strength increased daily. Training exercises held throughout early 1944 along Britain's southern coast provided grim reminders of the plan's dangers. During Operation Tiger, a rehearsal for Utah Beach conducted in late April 1944, German torpedo boats attacked a convoy of landing ship tanks, sinking to vessels and killing over 700 American servicemen. The disaster revealed coordination failures and communication problems, but it also validated the Higgins boat's performance. Despite chaos, confusion, and enemy action, the landing craft successfully delivered troops to the beach. The boats worked. Whether they could work under the concentrated hell of German defensive fire at Normandy remained the unanswerable question that haunted Eisenhower's sleep. By early June 1944, 175,000 Allied troops crowded into embarkation camps across southern England, waiting for the order to board ships that would carry them to Higgins's boats that would carry them to beaches that might become their graves. June 4th, 1944, Eisenhower stood in the doorway of Southwick House, watching rain slash across the English countryside with the fury of a disappointed god. His meteorologist, Group Captain James Martin Stagg, had just delivered devastating news. A massive storm system was churning across the English Channel, bringing winds that would capsize landing craft and waves that would swamp Higgins's boats before they reached the beach. The invasion, scheduled for June 5th, had to be postponed. 175,000 men, already loaded onto ships, would have to stand down. The decision tortured Eisenhower because delay meant disaster. German intelligence might discover the invasion force. Troop morale would deteriorate. Most critically, the tides and moon phases necessary for the assault conditions that exposed Rommel's obstacles while providing enough moonlight for airborne operations wouldn't align again for weeks. If they couldn't invade on June 6th or 7th, the operation might be delayed until July, giving Germany additional time to strengthen defenses and possibly redeploy forces from the Eastern Front. In cramped quarters aboard the USS Augusta, anchored off Portsmouth, Rear Admiral John Leslie Hall, Jr. reviewed reports from his landing craft commanders with growing concern. The Higgins boats, for all their utility, possessed inherent limitations that rough weather magnified catastrophically. The flat-bottom design that allowed beach landings also meant the boats slammed brutally through waves, exhausting coxswains and drenching troops with icy water. In heavy seas, the LCVP could take on water faster than its pumps could expel it. Hall had seen it happen during rehearsals over laden boats, simply sinking in deep water, dragging men down by the equipment weight they carried. The troops packed aboard transport ships off the English coast endured their own special misery during the delay. Combat engineers, infantry soldiers, and tank crews sat in ships' holds, wearing full combat gear, breathing recycled air thick with cigarette smoke and vomit, knowing that within hours they'd be climbing down cargo nets into small boats that would carry them toward beaches defended by the German army's best troops. Many wrote last letters home. Some prayed. Others played cards with grim concentration, willing themselves not to think about what morning would bring. June 5th brought Eisenhower and his senior commanders together for the most consequential weather briefing in military history. Captain Stagg reported a possible break in the storm, a narrow window of marginally acceptable conditions on June 6th. Winds would remain high, but might drop enough for landing craft operations. Cloud cover would hamper air support. Seas would still be rough, challenging but possibly manageable for Higgins boats. Stagg emphasized that conditions would be far from ideal, but the window existed. Eisenhower polled his commanders. Air Marshal Arthur William Tedder, his deputy, argued for delay, fearing that inadequate air cover would doom the invasion. General Bernard Law Montgomery, commanding ground forces, voted to proceed. Montgomery never favored caution. Admiral Bertram Home Ramsey, responsible for the naval operation, expressed concerns about rough seas, but acknowledged that his landing craft crews were trained and ready. The decision ultimately rested entirely with Eisenhower. He sat quietly for several minutes, the weight of countless lives pressing on him. Then, in a moment that historians would analyze for generations, he said simply, "Okay, we'll go." The order would send thousands of Higgins boats toward the most heavily defended coastline on Earth, piloted by young sailors barely out of their teens, carrying troops who would either liberate Europe or die trying. Everything Andrew Higgins had built, every modification learned from Pacific combat, every training hour, all of it came down to this bet on plywood and courage against concrete and steel. Throughout the night of June 5th, the greatest armada in human history formed up in the English Channel. Nearly 7,000 vessels, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, minesweepers, transport ships, and thousands of landing craft began crossing the dark water toward Normandy. In transport ships' holds, soldiers prepared equipment one final time, checking weapons, ammunition, and gear with hands that trembled despite their best efforts. Coxswains ran through mental checklists, knowing that within hours they'd be navigating by compass toward beaches they'd only seen in photographs, under fire from enemies determined to kill them. Eisenhower drafted a message to be released in case the invasion failed, accepting full responsibility for the disaster. He kept the note in his wallet. Then he went to visit paratroopers preparing to board planes, offering encouragement to men who, like the Higgins boat crews, faced death as a job requirement. The die was cast. June 6th, 1944. 0600 hours, the first Higgins boat touched sand on Omaha Beach, and hell erupted with mechanical precision. German machine gunners in concrete bunkers had waded through the naval bombardment, emerged from deep shelters, and now concentrated their fire on the bow ramps as they dropped. Bullets struck metal with sounds like hammers on anvils. Men fell before they could take a step. Blood mixed with seawater on the plywood decks. Seaman First Class James Robert Thornton, a 19-year-old coxswain from Oklahoma, guided his LCVP through surf that tossed the 36-foot boat like a toy. His cargo 32 soldiers from the 29th Infantry Division crouched below the gunwales, trying to make themselves small as German fire raked the approaching landing craft. Thornton had practiced this approach 100 times along English beaches. Nothing had prepared him for the reality. Boats exploding as mines detonated, wounded men screaming in the water, floating bodies bumping against his hull as he navigated toward a beach that looked like vision of apocalypse. The plan called for Thornton to beach his boat, drop the ramp, discharge his troops in 30 seconds, then reverse off and return for another load. Reality destroyed plans. As his boat grounded on sand, Thornton lowered the ramp and German machine guns immediately concentrated fire on the opening. The first 5 men died before clearing the ramp. The rest
hesitated, paralyzed by the realization that charging forward meant almost certain death. Their lieutenant, a young officer from Virginia whose name Thornton never learned, screamed something, an order or a prayer, and led a rush off the boat. Thornton never saw him again. Reversing off the beach required brutal skill. The LCVP's propeller churned sand and blood-clouded water. Obstacles scraped the hull. An explosion to Thornton's left threw another landing craft into the air, its back broken, spilling soldiers into deep water where their heavy equipment dragged them under. Thornton fought his steering, finally backing into deeper water, then turning for the transport ships hovering several miles offshore. His boat had 7 bullet holes through off the plywood hull. He'd been on the beach for less than 3 minutes. The carnage at Omaha Beach nearly destroyed Eisenhower's entire plan. German defenses there proved far stronger than intelligence had predicted. The 29th and 1st Infantry Divisions, delivered by Higgins boats onto a killing ground, suffered catastrophic casualties in the first hour. Companies that landed with 150 men found themselves reduced to 20 or 30 effectives within minutes. Bodies floated in the surf. Wounded men drowned as incoming tides covered them. The beach became littered with destroyed equipment, burning vehicles and casualties that medics couldn't reach because German fire dominated the open sand. Yet the Higgins boats kept coming, wave after wave after wave. Coxswains guided their craft through obstacles, through fire, through seas red with blood. Many died at their steering positions, cut down by machine gun fire or shrapnel. Others completed trip after trip, delivering reinforcements and supplies despite witnessing horrors that would haunt them forever. The boat's plywood construction, which couldn't stop bullets, paradoxically aided survival. German rounds passed clean through rather than ricocheting inside the hull. Small comfort for men already dead, but it saved some who might otherwise have died from friendly fire. At Utah Beach, Gold Beach, Juno Beach, and Sword Beach, conditions varied but the pattern remained consistent. Higgins boats delivered the initial assault waves, absorbed terrible casualties, then continued operating throughout the day. By nightfall on June 6th, the landing craft had transported over 132,000 troops to Norman beaches. Over 9,000 Allied soldiers had been killed or wounded, but the invasion had succeeded. Hitler's Atlantic Wall had been breached at 5 points simultaneously, exactly as Eisenhower had gambled. Seaman Thornton made 4 trips to Omaha Beach on D-Day. On his final run, just before dark, he delivered combat engineers and demolition equipment to clear obstacles for the next day's operations. German artillery still fell randomly across the beach, but organized defensive fire had largely ceased. American troops held a shallow but secure foothold. Thornton's boat, riddled with holes and running on a damaged engine, barely made it back to his transport ship. He collapsed on deck, physically and emotionally spent, haunted by images of men dying on his ramp, in his boat, in water that would forever seem too red in his nightmares. June 7th, 1944 through August 19th, 1944, the period historians would remember as the Battle of Normandy, depended absolutely on a logistical achievement that received far less attention than dramatic infantry assaults. Higgins boats had to deliver everything required to sustain and expand the invasion. Every bullet, every bandage, every gallon of gasoline, every replacement soldier, every tank, every artillery shell, all of it crossed the beach-to-ship barrier via landing craft that Andrew Higgins had designed on a napkin 3 years earlier. The scale of this operation defied comprehension. Allied forces required 15,000 tons of supplies daily, and that figure climbed as armies expanded inland. Traditional ports remained in German hands. The Allies wouldn't capture Cherbourg until late June, and even then, German demolition. Had destroyed the harbor facilities so thoroughly that it took weeks to restore functionality. Until conventional logistics could be established, everything depended on landing across the beaches, a euphemism for the grinding, exhausting, dangerous work of running Higgins boats and larger landing craft through surf, 24 hours per day, regardless of weather. The English Channel provided its own resistance to liberation. Storms struck throughout June and July, creating conditions that sank landing craft, damaged ships, and delayed critical supplies. The Great Storm of June 19th through 22nd proved particularly devastating, destroying more vessels than German action had managed during the invasion itself. Over 300 landing craft and several dozen ships were lost or badly damaged. The storm delayed operations by 3 days, creating supply shortages that nearly halted Allied advances. Yet even during the storm's height, some Higgins boats continued operating, piloted by crews who understood that soldiers inland were running low on ammunition and medical supplies. Coxswains developed an almost supernatural ability to read weather, tides, and beach conditions. They learned which sections of which beaches offered the best approaches. They memorized tidal schedules by heart. They developed techniques for navigating through obstacles, grounding on sand at optimal angles, and reversing off beaches in record time. The work brutalized men and machines equally. Coxswains regularly worked 16-hour shifts, and the Higgins boats themselves required constant maintenance. Saltwater corroded engines, sand fouled pumps, rough usage broke fittings and damaged hulls. Maintenance crews worked miracles keeping the landing craft operational. The logistical achievement extended beyond mere transportation. Beach organizations developed sophisticated systems for managing the flow of men and materiel. Traffic controllers directed landing craft to specific sectors. Shore parties unloaded cargo with assembly line efficiency. Raves registration units dealt with the constant stream of casualties being evacuated back to England. Medical corpsmen established aid stations directly on beaches, treating wounded as landing craft delivered them from inland fighting. The beaches became vast, chaotic, violent factories processing the machinery of war. German resistance complicated everything. Artillery regularly shelled beaches and harbors. Luftwaffe bombers, though increasingly rare, still conducted night raids. Naval mines drifted into shipping lanes. The threat never entirely disappeared, and landing craft crews operated, knowing that a NI trip might be their last. According to documentation held by the United States Navy's History Division, over 300 landing craft were lost to enemy action, weather, and accidents during the Normandy campaign, a casualty rate that demonstrated the operation's grinding nature. By August 19, 1944, when the Falaise pocket closed and German forces in Normandy faced annihilation, Allied armies had pushed far inland. The beachhead that Higgins' boats had established on June 6th had expanded into a massive logistical network supporting over 2 million troops. The boats continued operating, though their role gradually shifted from frontline assault to rear area support as conventional ports came online and the front moved beyond landing craft range. Historians analyzing the Normandy campaign consistently identify the landing craft operations as the critical enabling factor for Allied victory. Eisenhower himself would later state that Andrew Higgins deserved recognition among the men who won the war, declaring that Higgins is the man who won the war for us, in reference to the landing craft designs that made amphibious operations possible. The boats themselves, battered and worn, many decorated with unity, so insignia and sardonic names painted by their crews became symbols of American industrial might and the courage of young sailors who piloted fragile vessels into modern warfare's mechanical hell. September 2, 1945, the day Japan signed surrender documents aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, marked the final validation of Andrew Higgins's revolutionary designs. The Pacific War, even more than Europe, had depended on amphibious operations. From Guadalcanal to Okinawa, every island taken, every beachhead established, very advanced toward Japan's home islands required landing craft. Over 20,000 Higgins boats participated in Pacific operations, delivering Marines and soldiers onto hostile shores across an ocean that stretched 6,000 miles. The war had transformed Higgins Industries into an industrial colossus that produced not just landing craft, but also patrol torpedo boats and various support vessels. At peak production, the company's multiple plants employed over 30,000 workers and produced over 2,700 red vessels monthly. The economic impact on New Orleans proved equally transformative. Higgins Industries had generated hundreds of millions of dollars in economic activity and provided unprecedented employment opportunities, particularly for women and African Americans who found relatively well-paying industrial jobs in a city where such opportunities had been rare. Yet Andrew Higgins himself fared poorly in peace. The federal government canceled contracts immediately after Japan's surrender, leaving Higgins Industries holding massive debts and facilities designed for wartime. Production volumes. Higgins attempted to convert to civilian manufacturing, pleasure boats, commercial vessels, construction equipment, but his company never regained its wartime success. The boat builder who'd employed 30,000 people found himself struggling with bankruptcy by the early 1950s. He died on August 1, 1952, at age 66, financially diminished, but historically vindicated. Dwight Eisenhower never forgot the plywood boats that made his strategy possible. After the war, now serving as Army Chief of Staff before his eventual presidency, Eisenhower wrote extensively about the factors that determined victory. In every analysis, he emphasized logistics, engine, airing, and industrial production. Regarding Higgins, Eisenhower's assessment remained consistent. Without the landing craft, the Allies couldn't have executed the amphibious operations necessary to defeat the Axis powers. The Supreme Commander understood better than anyone how completely victory had depended on those fragile-seeming plywood boxes. The legacy extended beyond military history into engineering philosophy. Higgins had demonstrated that elegant solutions often emerge from practical experience rather than theoretical expertise. His lack of formal engineering credentials, which critics had cited as disqualifying, proved irrelevant compared to his understanding of how boats actually behaved in real conditions. The LCVP's design, simple, robust, manufacturable, maintainable, anticipated principles that would dominate post-war engineering: modularity, standardization, ease of production, and fitness for purpose. Military planners studying amphibious operations ever since have grappled with the fundamental truth that Higgins understood instinctively. Getting from ship to shore under hostile fire requires accepting vulnerability in exchange for speed and volume. Modern landing craft incorporate armor, improved power plants, and sophisticated systems, but they still embody Higgins's basic INSIG HT, the bow ramp that transforms a boat into a bridge between sea and land. Every amphibious operation conducted by American forces since 1945 has relied on descendants of Higgins's design. The human cost remained incalculable. Thousands of young sailors piloted Higgins boats into combat, and hundreds died doing so. Tens of thousands of soldiers rowed the landing craft toward hostile beaches, and many never returned. The boats themselves became artifacts of memory. Museums across America display preserved examples. Their plywood hulls and steel ramps stand in G as monuments to both ingenuity and sacrifice. Veterans who survived would forever associate the distinctive sound of a diesel engine and the metallic clang of a dropping ramp with the most terrifying moments of their lives. In New Orleans, the National World War II Museum stands on the site where Higgins Industries once produced landing craft at the rate of one every 17 minutes. The museum's exhibits explore the war's multiple dimensions, but it returns repeatedly to the fundamental question Higgins answered: how do you project military power across water onto hostile shores? His solution, audacious, practical, constructed largely of plywood and courage, determined whether democracy would survive the 20th century's greatest crisis. June 6, 2024, marked the 80th anniversary of D-Day. The few surviving veterans, now in their late 90s, returned to Normandy beaches that have been transformed into memorials. They walked sand where they once ran under fire, approaching bunkers that no longer hide machine guns. And they remembered the journey that brought them there. Ding in cold water at dawn, climbing down cargo nets into small boats, riding toward shore while shells fell around them, feeling the boat's bottom scrape sand, seeing the ramp drop, making the choice to charge forward into whatever waited beyond. Every one of those memories, every liberation, every victory, every soldier who survived to grow old, all of it depended on one boat builder's insane plywood ramp and his stubborn insistence that the impossible was merely difficult. Andrew Jackson Higgins built more than boats. He built bridges. Bridges between sea and shore, between industrial capacity and military necessity. Tie between American ingenuity and Allied victory. History remembers generals and presidents, but wars are won by sailors piloting plywood boxes into hell, carrying soldiers who believed that freedom was worth dying for, delivered there by a cantankerous boat builder who knew more about bayous than battlefields, and changed the world because of it.